The general theme of this G20 in Korea is the role of the G20 in the post-crisis world. So this is a recognition that the world is still in crisis, some countries are beginning to see an end to it, but there are still remaining issues, very important issues on growth now or long-term sustainability of growth, the whole concern about protectionism, strengthening the financial system and make sure that there are safety nets that and safeguards that avoid another financial crisis. And of course, what is going to be at the center of the conversation is currency wars. What countries are doing to boost their exports and inhibit imports in some form of protectionism by using their exchange rates. Those are going to be very, very difficult, critical issues. Who is invited and who belongs to the G20 continues to be a very thorny issue. The countries that are excluded, of course, criticize and lament the composition, claiming that it's not representative. But those that are there, in fact, account for 85% of the world's GDP. So it is an assembly of big players. Plus has the advantage of being highly diverse, is no longer the old G7 of advanced countries that included only developed countries, but now we have countries like Saudi Arabia and Brazil and Mexico and Indonesia and so on. And then there are the surprises that are also very reflective of how the world is working these days, in which small countries are trying to elbow their way in and try to be part and be at the table where these conversations and decisions are made. Holland was typically invited. This time it was not invited. The government of South Korea decided not to invite Holland. Instead, they invited Singapore. And that shows you both the fact that this is Asia and where are the alliances there and what are the priorities, but it also shows you a very interesting dynamic between countries and regions and where the balance of power is shifting. We should care about the G20 because if things don't work out, that has consequences on employment, on if you can even get a mortgage again, how much are you going to pay for your mortgage? What are you going to pay for imports? How much food will cost? All of these things that sound remote, the meeting sounds remote, has very direct consequences in the pocketbooks and lifestyles and life and living standards of people around the world. One of the strengths of the G20 when it began was the diversity of its composition. It had all kinds of members. It had China and the United States. It had Brazil and Indonesia and Mexico and Turkey. And that was a very important element in giving to the world the sense that these are diverse countries that had a common vision ahead. That diversity is now becoming a weakness, because in effect they are very different countries. Some countries have never stopped growing during the crisis, others are mired in recession. Some countries continue to be very strong exporters, others are net importers. Some are exporting, some have very high levels of savings, and others have very high levels of consumptions, and this needs to be rebalanced. So what is dividing the G20 is how to deal with these imbalances and the dislocations created by the ascent of these new players. I think it was a good thing that the G20 existed during the financial crisis. It sent markets the signal that there was someone in charge, even if that was not completely true. The notion that you have all these leaders that accounted for such a big chunk of the global economy getting together and finding a common path towards recovery, and how to deal with the banking crisis, and how to stimulate growth, that was a very important signal to the world, a very important signal to financial markets, a very strong signal of confidence. So at that moment, at the moment of the deepest, darkest stage of the crisis, having the G20 was very important. Now we know that the execution of a lot of those promises did not come to fruition. They are still squabbling and dividing and fighting over things. But some progress has been made. They have agreed, for example, to restructure the governance structure of the IMF, which is one of the decisions that's going to be made here, in which the governance, the board of directors, the executive, the board of the IMF, where decisions are made, is going to reflect more the realities of this world in which, this new world in which China is going to be more weight, and countries like Belgium and other small European countries are going to have a lower representation, which before they had a disproportionate presence. So it's things like that where there is still progress being made. There are very big challenges to be tackled by 20 countries that are so different. So we are going to see progress when the big players that account for a big part of the problem will get together. The currency wars and everything that's happening with currencies can be attenuated if the United States and China agree to a package of measures that is not only related to the exchange rate, in which things that China can do and the United States can do in order to alleviate some of the frictions that are creating and that have an expression in the exchange rate. And so within the G20, I think one has to find subgroups of countries that can work together, that you don't need the whole group, but that some countries acting together can move the ball forward much more effectively. What I'm suggesting is some form of minilateralism inside the G20, which is not multilateral. The G20 does not include all the countries in the world, but is a subset of countries that matter. As I said before, 85% of the world economy is represented in that group. And so there is more chance of having agreements between those countries that if you bring everybody to the table in conversations. That has the problems of calling it non-representative, exclusionary, creating a democratic deficit because it's not fair that some countries are not represented. And all of that is true. Those are valid criticisms. But it's better to have those criticisms, in my judgment, and those defects, than having a situation where nothing happens. So minilateralism, which is the alternative to multilateralism in many ways, is defective. But multilateralism, in which everybody is representing but nothing happens, is even more defective. So I would rather have a group of countries that is small, manageable, that can reach an agreement, that are countries that account for a big part of the problem or a big part of the solution or both, getting together the smallest number of countries that account for the largest consequence for a problem. And that is what I call minilateralism. The global economy today is much stronger than what it was a year ago. But again, as we have seen, there are still very, very weak spots. Some countries are recovering quite nicely. Some are never slowed down significantly. And others are deeply, deeply mired in a situation that is terrible. Some of the hard-hit countries in Europe are just going through a very difficult process. I'm thinking Spain, particularly, Ireland, Greece. We know where things are not going well. But in the rest of the world, the situation is much better than what experts told us it was going to be when the crisis hit. The same experts that did not call the crisis did not call the recovery. It's important to emphasize that the crisis, the crash, caught us by surprise. Very few experts anticipated the size and scope of this crisis. And then they told us that it was going to go on for a decade, that it was going, we're still talking about double-dip recession, that it was going to affect, that it was going to be much deeper and broad-based and all-encompassing than has turned out to be. We're still in the middle of it in many ways, but we are doing much better than what the experts told us at the time in which the crisis exploded. I think the world is growing, and the world will be growing in some places quite significantly. But again, growth is going to be uneven, and there is still a lot of apprehension and nervousness. Financial markets are still very volatile. There is no clear signals about the direction of some important variables. We still have debates about stimulus or controlling the deficits. We are still not clear. There are experts that predict a deflationary environment. Others are very worried about inflation. We are still in a very, very confusing world, but the world is growing, and some places are, regardless of all these debates, are doing quite well. The reform of the international monetary system is a subject that emerges every time that there is a financial crash in the world. If you read what was the communique of the heads of states or the ministers of finance or the governors of central banks after you had the Asian crisis or the Russian crisis or the tequila crisis in Mexico or any of the many financial crises we have seen, you will always see that there is in the communique a commitment to redesign the global financial architecture, which means a lot of things, and then they start with great emphasis and enthusiasm trying to reform it, and two things happen. One is that it turns out to be more complicated than what anybody anticipates, and players, the affected, the interest groups affected by those reforms react and try to block the reforms. At the same time, growth comes back faster than anyone anticipated, therefore lowering the appetite for the difficult, politically costly decisions. So more complicated, more difficult, and more costly, and at the same time, things begin to go better. So the urgency for reform dwindles. So the redesign of the global architecture is always postponed until the next crisis.